As 1995 was coming to a close, the Sega Saturn was ramping up to release its 3 biggest software titles to date. The hype for Virtua Cop, Sega Rally Championship, and Virtua Fighter 2 was immense. Gaming magazines for months had been building up expectations that these would redefine what everyone thought the hardware was capable of. As the screenshots and interviews rolled in, it was clear that these titles would put the stuff we had seen so far to shame. And my god was I excited. I had loved the arcade versions, and the thought of getting them at home mostly faithful was the stuff of dreams for me. But one fateful trip to Sears at the local indoor mall that December revealed a 16-bit title I had overlooked during the excitement of those monumental Saturn releases. Sears had a Sega Genesis demo set up as it always did, but this time there was something on the screen I just couldn't wrap my head around. Toy Story could have easily been mistaken for an early 32-bit release, and the fires of curiosity burned bright within me to see everything it had to offer. In this episode, we will be taking a look at it, go over what made it so special, and discuss the shortcomings that held it back from greatness. Hope you guys enjoy my review of Toy Story for the Sega Genesis. Toy Story was originally released in November of 1995, developed by Traveler's Tales and Psygnosis, with Sega and Disney Interactive handling the publishing side. The story cinematics open up with the toys in Andy's house, trying to find out what he's getting for his birthday. You play as Woody, a cowboy that has been Andy's favorite toy for years, and you find out that there's a new toy that threatens your standing. Yep, it's pretty close to the movie as far as the narrative. An Etch-a-Sketch gives you a mission description for each stage, and you would do well to pay close attention to it. This is especially true since the game uses a few different gameplay styles across its 18 levels. There are standard platforming levels where Woody can jump and use his pull string as a whip. This can stun enemies for a short amount of time, and it can be used as a way to hook on predetermined points and swing to different parts of the stage. Your hit points are indicated by the stars in the upper left-hand corner, and your lives are the cowboy hats in the opposite side. Within all the stages, you can collect 10 stars for extra health, extra lives, and extra continues, which add up at the end of every level. There are also overhead racing stages where you must collect batteries to keep your charge up. There are stages where you are riding other toys and avoiding obstacles. There is a first-person Doom-style area where you roam around in a very convincing 3D environment, helping aliens escape. There's even a third-person driving level that could easily pass for something on the 3DO or Jaguar. The vast majority of Toy Story is of the tried-and-true platformer, however. These stages are objective-based and have checkpoints within to help you deal with the challenge. These are flagpoles that you can raise Super Mario style. Most of this stuff is avoiding enemies and damage. There's very little in the way of combat or violence against the other toys. There are some boss encounters, but these battles are usually based on doing something to hinder the other character, and not really hurting them in any traditional sense. It definitely earns its kids rating and is quite suitable for your children in terms of content. The Sega Genesis version also has a special bonus stage hidden within if you collect enough stars during the various stages. It is also a one-player experience. Traveler's Tales has been known to be quite the programming wizards, or more specifically John Burton. The visuals of Toy Story use a lot of pre-rendered animation and a 32 megabit cartridge to make sure it's all silky smooth. The sprites in this game have some of the prettiest motion you will ever see in a 16-bit title. Most games during this time that were considered well animated pale in comparison. What really makes this thing stand out is the fact most of the sprite work is also huge. Woody himself is much larger than the typical characters of the time, and his friends and enemies are as well. It makes all that great animation stick out even more. One might assume that with all the focus on the moving pieces, that the backgrounds would suffer. Not so, because these backdrops are loaded with tons of line scrolling that really give everything a feeling of a 2.5D presentation. When things are firing on all cylinders, it's drop dead gorgeous. And that's just the average platforming area. Once you start getting to the 3D Doom-like level, I was sat there in stunned amazement. Hell, give these guys a decent ROM size and some time, and I'm pretty sure they could have made one heck of a first-person shooter on the Genesis. The third-person driving segment was also really impressive. I mean, software sprite scaling had been really impressive before on the Genesis, but this makes you wonder why the hell Traveler's Tales wasn't porting Sega's arcade titles before this. This particular stage was not in the Super Nintendo version of the game either. If it seems like I'm gushing, well, I am. This is a really impressive game across the board visually. Animation, background, special effects, color, it all really comes together for one heck of a showing for hardware that was 7 years old at this point. No mincing words here. This game is a visual winner from the first stage to the very last. Toy Story uses gems for its sound driver, and I have to admit I was somewhat surprised at this. While it won't be on any best of lists for the Genesis, I really think most of the sound effects and music come off really well. It even has a fair bit of digitized voice, which is really well done. It's the kind of stuff that fits the narrative and never gets in the way. Some of it is really happy and upbeat, and some of it is faster and darker if the situation calls for it. You know the drill. I have a few examples to see what you think. Despite the impressive visual showcase and the music that fit it so well, Toy Story was unfortunately a mixed bag in terms of gameplay. It isn't that anything is specifically done terribly. I'd even argue that most of this game is very fun. It's mainly that Woody is so large on the screen and has such an awkward attack, it makes the control feel unwieldy as you take easy damage in the latter half of the adventure. The fact that the hitboxes are so large doesn't help with that, and the pull string whip doesn't feel like it has any real quickness. It feels as if it takes a second to animate outwards and actually hit anything, which of course leads to you taking damage, especially up close. It's also kinda weak that enemies aren't knocked off the screen when you hit them. Ground enemies are tied up for a few seconds, while air enemies continue to move. I can't say I'm fond of that because it means after a second or two, they are able to hit you again. You get used to all of this, of course, and the opening stages are easy enough that it teaches you the ins and outs of what to expect. The difficulty does get a nasty spike later on, and you're gonna need those extra lives and continues. By default, you get a few lives and no continues, which means once you deplete your opening stock of chances, back to the title screen you go to start from stage 1. With all of that said, the real strength of Toy Story is its variety. By offering up different objectives and gameplay styles, it never really becomes boring. Of the available stage types, the overhead driving levels were by far my least favorite. The first of these levels are easy enough. Just take your time, collect the batteries, and you'll be at the end in no time. But the second level that uses this view is much longer, more open, harder to navigate, and I spent all my lives here multiple times trying to beat it. While I was able to play the other stages enough to find the best way forward, this stage alone made me want to stop playing entirely. I eventually looked up a map to follow, but man was that incredibly frustrating. And that is this game in a nutshell. It has great visuals, a fun soundtrack, and gameplay that ranges from really fun to downright headache-inducing. Not having any continues by default means you will be starting over from the beginning a lot, something that shouldn't have been the case considering its target audience. Years later, I discovered the international versions of Toy Story came with a freaking password system that was completely omitted from the US release. Passwords make this game so much more accessible, and if you are gonna play it, especially with your kids, be sure to pick a region that supports those passwords. At the time, the reviews for Toy Story were quite contentious. I remember Electronic Gaming Monthly having some pretty varied opinions on it, and GamePro was even more split, celebrating its incredible visuals while lamenting the flawed gameplay. This stood in direct contrast to most of the European magazines that rated it much more evenly. Pretty much every publication I knew of enjoyed it, and I am almost certain it was because of the password feature. It takes a game that has a handful of difficult areas and gives you a way to not have to start over from the beginning every single time you run out of lives. This game was aimed squarely at kids in the US that would have been quite young, and with no way to resume their game other than restarting it every single time was a real bummer. It is curious to note that the PAL versions of Toy Story were not released until early 1996, so it's almost as if the developers and publishers recognized it was a mistake not to have a way to continue your game. It's also really interesting to see the Genesis version running side by side against its Super Nintendo counterpart. Traveler's Tales did an excellent job all the way around, and outside of some color variations, the Genesis holds its own very nicely. The fact that the Genesis version also has the third-person driving segment and the first-person level is longer is just icing on the cake. Despite its gameplay issues and despite my focus on the Saturn in late 1995, I still found time to play this game. It was great seeing Disney and Sega still pairing up so well, and while it wasn't perfect, it was still a great little trip that was well worth taking. It was pretty incredible that 7-year-old hardware was still bringing me Christmas joy. Sega should have commissioned a port of this for the Saturn that same year. That may have been a real treat with a full 32-bit presentation. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.